All righty, thank you. It's so lovely to see you, Meredith.
It's so lovely to see you. I logged on to your site this morning just to sort of reacclimate myself to the details. And I was so gratified to see an AI conference with so many Black women, so many people of color. Like, it was, after the events of this week, it was like, it gave me this little spark of hope that, reforming this field in that image might be possible. So I just want to thank you for that. It was really inspiring after an otherwise pretty hard week in this space.
I understand. Thank you so much for the feedback. Well, it is intentional. We are doing this because we felt like the lack of representation in the industry is such a huge issue, but the way Black women and women of color are being used and then discarded is just unconscionable. And we want to stop that. We will publish the diversity statistics for our conference. We are diversity first, not in just terms of, everybody says that, but what does it mean? It means we start with recruiting Black women of color first for our events, very simply because we don't want this to be tokenism, because this is how most conferences are. They fill it up with cis white women, and then they invite, okay, here's a token Black woman, and there's a woman of color. So we'll try our best. 40% of our speakers are Black women, and that's intentional. And we will continue to work on those numbers and grow them, and just want everyone to know this is your space, this is your community. So that said, can I just start with, how are you feeling? How are you? Are you okay?
Yes and no. I think it's been really, really shocking in a number of ways to see the way that Google has treated Dr. Timnit Gebru, one of the leaders in the ethical AI space, one of the people who's done more than almost anyone to push for real substantive change, both to the way these technologies are created and deployed, to make sure they're safe, to make sure they're equitable, to make sure they're accountable to the people who bear those risks, and to do the type of work you were just describing, that intentional, painstaking work of reshaping this field so it's safe for Black women, so it's safe for people who aren't the Stanford educated white cis man with an engineering degree. Because, as we're seeing, the evidence is in, there's no debate that, technologies that are created in the image of these sort of corporate incentives and the sort of, white male prerogative are dangerous for the rest of us. And sadly, these dangerous technologies are being threaded through so many areas of our lives in ways that are, we're already seeing the consequences. So I want to say that I think this is a really serious moment for this space. I think there's no sideline to stand on anymore. This is not a thought experiment. It's important that we pick a side and recognize that there are, significant public stakes to what just happened at Google, and this pattern of pushing out people who actually speak for the public interest and actually speak for anti-racism and real diversity in those rooms. Yeah.
Thank you for everything that you're doing. We did circulate the petition. We'll put it back into our chat. We'll make sure all our attendees get a list. Thank you for everything that you do, because exactly what you said, this is an inflection point. If you think about 2020, there are so many issues that have been building up over the years, but now there is no excuse. We can no longer pretend this is not happening. The denial, the rationalization, saying that this was just a one-off, or this didn't really happen, all the constant gaslighting when we are told to believe that what you're seeing is not reality. It's happening in politics, it's happening in tech. And if you think there's a nexus, right, it's the same people funding, whether it's a toxic politics or whether it's toxic technology, the same money flows to both places. So if we don't take a stand now, when do we do it? And if it's not us, who? But that said, I appreciate some folks have the privilege to stand up and take a stance, and some of us have made that intentional decision. Earlier this year, we decided that so much of the AI ethics conversation was getting hijacked by the big names, the powerful and the privileged. We made a conscious decision. We will always put marginalized groups first. We will surface those, right? We made that decision, but I understand that I came to this country as an immigrant, and I understand a lot of women don't have those choices. So I encourage everyone who's with us today to support in other ways. I mean, you know, Meredith, reach out to her. Please reach out to Timnit, offer your support. Do it in quiet ways. Not all protests have to be verbal and vocal. And we'll, if you can just keep us posted if there's a crowdfunding effort. We have put out a statement, and we are dedicating this summit to Timnit, and anything and everything that we can do to support you, please let us know. We will make sure.
Absolutely. And I want to say I am one of those privileged, cis white ladies who is able to, do this work. So I want to recognize that and say that, while I'm using the platform I happen to have to, help get as much of this information out there and help encourage as much solidarity for Timnit and her colleagues as possible. There are hundreds of people. There are people who are leading this from inside of Google. There are so many people doing this work, and so I guess what I would say is, like, I'm one of them, right? And I'm honored to be in solidarity with them. But there are so many ways that I think people from whatever position they're in can sort of support this and just figure out, based on who, if I'm speaking on a panel, right? Can I bring this up, right? If I'm doing work in this space in some other way, can I bring this up? Can I fight for this diversity? Can I also fight for research integrity? Because that's a core issue that Timnit and her colleagues brought up in the demands and in the kind of the recounting of this narrative is, research censorship. If there is research that challenges Google's monetary interest, if there is research that challenges the status quo, frankly, what appears to be happening is that research is spiked, right? And that has profound implications for our understanding of the world, right? For the types of knowledge that are permissible or not. And I think it's not an accident that the paper that was censored that Timnit and her colleagues and collaborators wrote was critiquing large-scale machine learning language models. So these are technologies that have gotten a fair amount of hype this year, right? If you think of GPT-2 and these other technologies, they're also technologies that are at the core of products like Google search, right? And so you see, I have a number of like DMs on my Twitter from men who were part of the machine learning research org at Google or other places, just being like, I never got that kind of scrutiny, right? Like, I published papers that didn't threaten Google. It went right through that process. So I think that's something we really need to look at that in combination with, like, okay, who is taking the heat, right? There are a number of co-authors there, but it's Timnit who gets fired. It's Timnit who gets paraded out by Google as a kind of icon of their commitment to diversity, and then discarded the second that she pushes too hard for actual changes that would sort of reflect those ersatz commitments by the company.
It's so, we've heard from so many folks who are just devastated by them. And she's been going through and having, it just lays bare, right? When you speak up and when you are trying to actually not coloring within the boxes that you've been provided by these tech companies, right? A lot of ethics washing happens. This is a real life case study, what happens when you speak up. And when we look back at this in time, in history, we want to make sure that has a positive outcome, that someone spoke up, not that there was retaliation, but it led to something better, and that we were able to reverse it, because the moment for doing that is now. We never want to look back and say, because when someday in future we're thinking back and say, what were you doing when this happened? We all want to be able to say, we did all that we could to fix this. That moment is now, and I'm so glad we are having this very important conversation. So again, thank you again for bringing awareness, for being there. If women with privilege don't stand up and do something about it, what hope do the rest of us have, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's at this point there's a kind of moral imperative, especially for the people in this space, right? You are making your name, you are making your salary, you are benefiting from your conversant understanding of these sort of ideas around race and bias and discrimination. And if you're not actually willing to put your skin in the game, then that's a whole dynamic that I'm too familiar with. But I think that's the litmus at this point, right? Are you willing to take a risk? Because it's clear, it has been clear. It is, it's been laid completely bare with the appalling treatment of Timnit, but it is extremely clear that power does not bend based on force of argument. This is not a debate, right? This is not some sort of, polite exchange of ideas. There are, people, there are winners to this, this dynamic, right? There are winners to racism, and there are people, who, don't want to challenge this structure and this system because they're doing fine, right? Like, you don't want to have to scrap search because you find, deep and untenable bias and kind of erroneous logic in the kind of core engines of some of this technology, right? So there's, we see that these dynamics are not sort of accidents, right? This isn't a bug in the system to be squashed. This is part of a, a structural apparatus based on white supremacy and misogyny that, it pervades our history, it pervades all of our institutions, but, the power it has right now, kind of through the tech industry and its infrastructures, I think is profound and frightening. So we absolutely have to push back. And I see Alex in the chat saying tech workers need a union, and I would say absolutely, tech workers need a union. That's something I'm fully committed to supporting. And I also think that while tech workers need a union, we need to look at the history of sort of unionism and organized labor and some of the the sad racism that's part of that history, and make sure that we're not just sort of adopting a model without scrutiny, without making sure that whatever we build to sort of live these values and build the power of that solidarity isn't sort of reflecting those histories, but is actually sort of committed to that anti-racism, committed to raising up these voices, as well as committed to giving workers and social movements kind of democratic control over some of these technologies.
Absolutely. I thank you so much, Alex. And we are planning to talk more about exactly that, which is why when I started planning, right, you and I started having discussions, inviting you, I had no idea, right? None of us that this is what we'd be talking about. And maybe the timing is exactly right because we should be talking more about these issues. But I do want to talk about more about unionization of workers and such. But I want to also point something that you said was very interesting. You said it's part of a pattern. And I couldn't agree more because the system is not broken. People keep trying to say we can fix it. The system was built this way. This is how they are. And now that we are questioning the system itself and you're seeing this retaliation, and I'm seeing these parallels between what's happening in the politics, right? How we still have folks who are, I'm not really a racist, but I support this precedent. Versus now we are saying, I'm not really anti-racism, or I'm for women, but I'm not support Black women, but I'm not really supporting this. I'm not supporting Timnit, right? So this is the point where we all have to take a stance. You can't be ethical by not including Black women. If you don't support Black women, and especially somebody, we are standing on the shoulders of them, right? Safiya Noble is going to be speaking tomorrow, by the way, as well. So I'm just super excited, like amazing women, we stand on the shoulders, we take their work, we all benefit. And yet when they are being retaliated against, like, we should all then step up and say, we are behind you rather than just benefit, because otherwise we are no better than the folks that we critique, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it, and you'll see on these sort of like forums or in sort of Google mailing lists, which I remember from when I was there, people chiming in to, like, well, kind of question the complexity of a given case, right? Oh, it looks like maybe, Jeff Dean has a point here or whatever, right? There's a lot of work being done by, kind of the assume good intent crowd and the people who, will kind of find some uncertainty in a complex narrative and amplify that to sow doubt, right? Like those, we got to expect that. We got to expect that, people, power retrenches, right? It doesn't give up without a fight. And we're seeing, there are a lot of tactics for how that, you know, retrenchment works, right? It's, you know, from the sort of gaslighting to the sea lining to the, you know, the explicit racialized retaliation that Timnit is experiencing. And I, you know, Timnit is like, we're looking at a luminary in the field. Like you couldn't be much more accomplished than Timnit. And I think, you know, there was a post from the Algorithmic Justice League this morning that really resonated with me. And I think it was Joy Buolamwini who said, you know, kind of we talking about kind of the relationship between her and Dr. Gebru and Deborah Raji, who is a up and coming star, kind of looking at a lot of these issues. And it was just like, you know, we recognize that, you know, you can have all the accolades, and I'm paraphrasing here, all the accolades and all the acclaim, and that's not going to protect us. You know, there's sort of, we need this like sisterhood, we need this solidarity in addition to that. And I think that's, you know, I'm just so glad that the people coming up have that type of profound insight, because I think that's, you know, that's what gives me hope, right? Because it's very clear we need that. And I'm glad to have folks like that leading here.
Absolutely. And I feel there's something about, we changed our focus earlier this year to make it also based on feedback from our last event, that we need to stop making like focused on academics. It's time for the planning and just talking is over. It's time for action. And if there's the one thing folks walk away with from this event is like, we have to do something, anything. We have to get out there. Sitting around and just, this is no longer an academic exercise. This is happening right now. And what are you going to do about it? And we all have to make that decision right now. It's the same happened with, it's been happening in politics. I keep seeing the same parallels, the disinformation, showing of like just doubt. Maybe there was something there that rationalizes this egregious decision, but there is none, and we just need to just solidarity, like, right, just line up, this is it, this is pretty much. So I would like to talk a little bit about your work, give folks some context, and talk about how we can support you going forward, because unionization, I feel, is like, should be on top of everybody's mind. So let's talk about your work. So you're now the faculty director at AI Now Institute at New York University. Could you talk some more about like what inspired that, like the creation of this institute?
Yeah, I can give a bit of background there, and just a fair warning, I will probably be coming back to the treatment of Timnit throughout this, because it's really what's on my mind right now. But so you know, I have a strange past. I was hired by Google kind of accidentally, it felt like, in 2006. And so I was there through this like just metastasis of the tech industry, right? And fast forward, I did a lot of work. I founded a research group. My background was in, you know, like a lot of the work I did was looking at sort of large scale network measurement. So like measuring internet performance. And the goal there was like, let's create a benchmark against which net neutrality can be measured. Now, like that was just diving into a nest of like gnarly problems around, you know, like deep epistemological problems, like how do you, you know, meaningfully represent something like internet performance, right? And it was, you know, I'm not going to dwell on that, but that sort of gave me this very deep skepticism about the ability of data to, you know, kind of reflect our chaotic and dynamic world, even at these sort of low level technical you know, sort of low on the stack. Like you'd think you could measure that accurately. Well, it turns out it's very, very difficult and very contingent. So I was sort of alerted, I guess, you know, because of my positionality, to kind of concerns around this like AI boom. So it was like 2014 when like there was a real kind of like the corporate productization, the commodification of these technologies. Like in my memory, this is around the time when I started seeing it just everywhere at the company. Like it was like the new hype, right? And I was really worried because I was like had this deep scrutiny on these sort of methods of data creation and collection, et cetera. And then suddenly there was just this drive to take any old random janky data set, create a model of the world, a hermetically sealed machine learning model of the world, and then project that, kind of deploy that out into the world as if it were capable of kind of superhuman magic, right? And clearly that's a great market strategy for people like Google, because suddenly they can sort of narrate themselves into any new market they want: education, healthcare, criminal justice, etc. Like, we build a magic machine, it replaces human decision making, it'll save you money, etc., etc. But all of these systems, as we've seen, are kind of flawed. They reflect the problems of the data they're trained on. They reflect the viewpoints of the people who created them. They reflect the capitalist incentives of the companies and institutions that deploy them. It's that they're riddled with problems. So anyway, AI now was created to kind of as part, like, a reaction to that concern and a recognition that the people who were sort of in a position of asking these questions sort of were like close to that action, to put it that way, were mostly inside private companies. So like, not, this debate was not happening in the open. There was like a real divergence between the marketing about these technologies, this sort of like hype filled, super intelligence nonsense, and the actual capabilities of these like clunky, weird contingent systems like trained on Reddit or whatever, wildness there. So AI now was like, how do we create a space that is much more grounded and that is able to sort of produce kind of more public knowledge, sort of, kind of shape a debate that is able to ask questions about these systems, that is sort of like recognizing their, their use here and now, and looking at whether they work, who do they work for, what are the bias issues, etc. So it was kind of trying to take it out of that corporate environment and create something that could be much more realistic about what these systems are and what they do.
Thank you for sharing that. I had other questions, but I'll just go to what's on everyone's mind, right? So when I landed in Silicon Valley as an immigrant, nobody was talking about tech unions. And which is, in hindsight, seems a little surprising. And now that we are thinking about the issues that tech workers are so vulnerable, they are so exposed to all of these issues, and there's no recourse for them. There's no community they can reach out to. There is no support system like unions do, right? Nobody is politicking or lobbying for their rights to speak up. Right. So this is also highlights some of the challenges. So can you help us understand just the history of unionizing and why has it been so hard for tech workers to unionize?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to approach that question. I think we need to kind of see that question in the context of the attack on organized labor that sort of began in the late 70s, although, there are different ways to narrate that genealogy. And look at kind of unionization and organization overall, right? We've seen our kind of worker protections whittled away. We've seen kind of unions, union size decrease, et cetera. So I think there is a history of kind of organizing in tech. There's a history of dissent among tech workers. It's really interesting, and it's something that a number of scholars right now are like Mar Hicks, Sarah Myers West, and others are looking to sort of kind of bring that history to light so we can draw on it. I think, there are tech workers, I think we have to pause and kind of ask who's a tech worker in this. And that's a question that, I've been thinking about with Sarah Myers West and some others. But, what, like, are we talking about the elite workers like myself or Timnit, or the people who have full-time employment? They're in engineering, they get, the bouncy balls and the micro kitchens and the food and all of this sort of, like best places to work, Fortune 500, mythology about tech? Or are we talking about the contract workers, which now make up over half of Google's workplace? Are we talking about the people who label the data, often contracted in, locations in the global South, who have terrible working conditions? Are we talking about content moderators? Like, are we talking about workers whose lives are mediated and controlled by tech, like Uber drivers or gig workers? So I think that is not an idle thought exercise, because what we're doing there is really thinking deeply about the types of solidarities we need to make to kind of make sure those who are most at risk are included, and also the types of solidarities we need to create to make sure we have the actual power to push back on companies whose sort of reach and breadth is so vast, and whose sort of entree into so many areas of our lives is so complex, right? So what would it take to have those types of solidarities? And then I think the organizing is the organizing, and it's actually it's ongoing, right? You saw the response to Timnit. It was like there's like in less than 24 hours there is a petition. There are people inside Google organizing. There is a concerted effort to push back on that, and those for me those are the seeds that get us to a union. But we need to make sure that union is inclusive, and that it's not just sort of like kind of affiliate with some AFL union that only the white collar elite workers in the US are able to join, and then we sort of put off the issue of more precarious workers or contract workers for later, which is a racialized decision, and which is a decision that when you put something off to later and don't center that as a concern, it's rare that it gets done. So I think that was a little bit rambling, but that gives you some of my thoughts on this. And I am optimistic that we're pushing forward, but we will need to change laws, and we will need to make sure that this is sort of global and inclusive.
Can I just point out that just what you outlined, and this is for folks, and it may be obvious for some, but not so for others, so I'll just say it. Being ethical and doing ethical things is complicated, right? Folks just think that this is some sort of a fun exercise they come into, oh, I'm working on ethics, but it is hairy, it's messy, it's a lot of hard work. You can't just put a PR statement and say we are ethical. You can't just publish one paper and say we are done. Now, this makes me like an expert on ethics. It literally a lot of groundwork that needs to be done, what you're doing, what others, like you mentioned, Mark Hicks and others are doing. You're laying the foundation, a solid foundation, which can then stand up, whether it's in terms of policies and giving the support resources within companies and such. So you're laying it out in a way that it's sustainable, because right now I feel like in the ethics world, the ethics washing has become this, what's a quick fix? Do I have checklists for this? Do I have something like I can just publish and say, okay, I'm doing something in this way? Because ethics is hard, right? But what you're doing is actually the meaningful work that will progress. So I admire that a lot. One thing you mentioned, could we talk a little bit about the retaliation? Especially you organized the walkout at Google, right? There were repercussions, I'm sure, and there was some retaliation. Can you walk us through your thought process? Like, it must have been scary. You're a person of privilege. How does one, like, what was going through your mind while you made the decision to organize, and you were one of the leading voices there, walk out of Google, but also then the retaliation? Like, what did you experience? And just to give people a reality check, like what it actually takes to do this.
Yeah, so I had been organizing before the walkout in response to kind of in recognition of the fact that kind of me, being able to have a voice was not actually the same as having power to implement some of those ethical determinations, right? So there's a kind of history there. I was one of many people who organized the walkout. I was one of the kind of core organizers who helped as like a hub that was working to coordinate with the global team of organizers who were able to kind of pull off a walkout of 20,000 people across the globe, which is an unprecedented labor action in tech. And I just want to send solidarity to those folks. There was a lot of people, and I think the retaliation was not surprising to me. Like, I've read my labor history, and it's just like I like think about power a lot. But it was, it was interesting because it was, it followed kind of like there was the playbook after the walkout. Everyone like in public was like, yes, love it, great work, and they continued to keep trying to narrow the walkout demands down to like women's issues, and it was like, no, it's class and race, like immediately they were trying to sort of like hem it into a kind of corporate feminist like lean in triumph, and then sort of like wash their hands of it. And I think we continue to push back. We continue to raise the issues of like the kind of racist, misogynist environment and the mistreatment of contract workers and all of these things. And then it's like the way that they retaliated against organizers in tech, I think, it follows the template of how, large corporations always, or companies always retaliate against organizers, right? It's like you find the people who they think are leading, and then they, hurt them in some way. And they hope that sends a message to the rest of the people that they shouldn't do that anymore, right? And like what we have to look out here is just like in tech, what does it mean to hurt someone, right? So you like fuck with you mess with their career. And in this case, it was like, saying that, oh no, I couldn't actually do work at AI Now anymore, even though that had been something that was like wildly celebrated in the company and they like loved it. It was just sort of like beginning to shift the parameters within which I was allowed to operate, through a number of procedural kind of moves. And then I was supposed to transfer to the machine learning group where I could do the AI Now work, which like the company claimed in its PR to support. And then suddenly Jeff Dean, like, put the stop to that transfer, even when it looked like it had been improved. And, like it's like moves like that, right? And so the way they tried to hurt me was by like kind of shutting down the prospects for me continuing my career. The way they tried, and you see like the way they tried to hurt Timnit, who's been an outspoken voice, like, not compromising on the changes that were needed, right? It's a similar template, and I don't want to compare what happened to me as like a direct analog to what's happening to Timnit, but I think the pattern is that these companies will not stand people who are actually pushing for the kinds of changes that on the, in their PR statements, the companies say they celebrate. So yeah, that was my experience.
It sounds brutal, and obviously, again, kudos to you, and again, much admiration and gratitude for what you did, because you could have chosen to walk away. You could have chosen to look the other way, because, like you said, you are one of the privileged women, and that hopefully sends a message to others as well with privilege, how you can actually use your privilege. There is also with the understanding that you may have to give up something. People think you can be ethical and still keep the status quo. Those can't really coexist, right? To be ethical and change the way things are, you have to change the status quo. You have, even if it may not benefit you to do that. And I think we underestimate the power, the courage it takes to do that. So kudos to you for your bravery in doing that. There was the solidarity among tech workers is critical, right, for this to succeed. So we talked at Google, and you said this is, again, not just a women's issue. We provide a platform to voices that need to be heard, right? We believe in true ethics. We are driving towards an ethical world. So within that, we talk about Google, but this is consistent across all the tech companies, isn't it? And do you see any inclination that other tech workers at other tech companies are also like, are they coming together in solidarity, is what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of efforts that are bringing a lot of those workers together across companies to share knowledge and solidarities. If you look at Amazon workers, I think their organizing has been extraordinary. You have sort of white collar organizers that started the Amazonians for Climate Justice, I believe it's called, but then, quickly recognized that they had, deep solidarity with warehouse workers who were also exposed to, environmental racism, often where these warehouses would bring in a bunch of trucks and kind of, often placed in lower income communities that had been disinvested in, where they were kind of an only source of jobs, and you would have sort of pollution and environmental impacts at these warehouses. They sort of connected these issues with, with Amazon's business models, with the kind of, Amazon's computational infrastructure. So I think there's been, they had a pretty significant walkout. You've seen Facebook workers who are organizing. The content moderators at Facebook have just organized and brought a lawsuit around their working conditions. I think, there's some organizing I know about that I can't speak about because it's still, it's, not all organizing is visible. So I think conflating visibility with power, or visibility with sort of continuity, is a mistake, because part of how we organize is we were very much used sort of press and visibility as part of a like arsenal of tactics, but not everyone. That doesn't make sense for everyone, and that had a lot to do with the people who were organizing, the fact that was part of the sort of toolbox they brought into the organizing. But there's a lot of organizing, and it's nice because you'll have, like people from one company reaching out to another, and it's like, oh, here's the documentation here. Here's how we did it. Maybe that works for you. I think one thing I'd like to point to is the No Tech for ICE organizing, because that for me is like it's kind of a really hopeful template, because it's not just building a hermetically sealed workers' democracy within a given company, right? Like I think expanding decision making to like 100,000 people when we're talking about global problems that probably don't harm those 100,000 people as much as they harm folks outside who are much more vulnerable. That's not the vision for sort of structural change that we need. But beginning to create sort of systems of decision making and systems of worker power that are linked with social movements that are then leading, I think is that's a positive vision for the future that like I will work in solidarity toward. And I think the No Tech for ICE movement sort of prefigures that in a number of ways, where there were really brilliant organizers who did immigrant rights and were working on the U.S. southern border on the issues around ICE's abuse and human rights abuses, and then we're linking with tech workers who understood the technology that was being used to sort of perpetrate those human rights abuses. And there was sort of a campaign that like spread across those realms, but recognized the necessity of the expertise of the people on the border who were living that experience alongside the expertise of the people who are building these technologies, and who may actually not know how they're used or how they're affecting people.
I think that is so critical. When we, and I apologize, I think some folks mentioned my audio is a little choppy. I hope I'm coming through okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Great. So when we talk about ethical AI, ethical tech, there is this misconception that we only talk about the technology itself, right? Is it built ethically and such? We continuously forget the people who are impacted by these technologies and people who are forced to work on those technologies, whether it is like your data labeling, which happens in other countries. What are the ethics of that, right? What about the ethics of where this technology is going to be deployed? That you can build a technology that's ethical, and yet it can be used in unethical ways. And ICE is a great example. So I would like to talk to you about, just changing gears slightly, is about a petition, the Prop 22, that you and Meredith Gebru have come out. So it was a disappointment, right? Like the fact that all the money and the Lyfts and the Ubers of the world could squelch some meaningful reform. Could you walk us through some of the parallels between what we're seeing in the tech world and also with these gig companies, because they're all part of the same ecosystem, aren't they? And the issues they face are similar. Do you mind walking us through that?
Yeah, and I do want to give a real shout out to my dear friend Dina Dubal, whose work has been foundational on these issues. I learn a lot from her, and kind of the way we've worked together is I can bring expertise on tech in that industry, and she brings deep labor expertise and a deep understanding of the driver struggle and the struggle in the gig economy and all of that history. So I can walk you through, but I would also recommend everyone sort of look into her work. She has a piece in Logic magazine on the history of the gig economy that's really good in framing this issue. But essentially, like, gig companies are the kind of tech companies, right? They leverage the ubiquity of our devices, and they leverage the like the fact that network computational technology is now everywhere, to basically like roll back labor protections, right? And I think Prop 22 was it is well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to like start how to walk through that, but basically gig companies advertise themselves, and this is I'm drawing on Vina's work here, advertise themselves as like flashy tech companies, right? They were like, this is innovative, like, who wants to hail a taxi with your arm when you could hail a taxi with your app? This is tech, right? And then they they sort of spun this mythology of the like the bootstrapped entrepreneur, the flexible worker, right? Like, who wants a boss? You can be, like, all of our drivers are entrepreneurs. So they created a narrative that was really compelling to a lot of people, specifically, people in DC, and a lot of the tech press who is at that point in history was extraordinarily enamored with Silicon Valley. And I think there are a lot of reasons why we have had about 20 years of almost zero pushback on that narrative, partly because, framing things as technology makes them seem complex and computational and maybe not, maybe off limits for a mortal who didn't have a fancy CS degree. So in any event, that, that was how these companies sort of justified and exploited this model. And then were kind of infused with a huge amount of venture capital cash, right, which allowed them to continue losing money as they, colonized these different markets. And I use that term advisedly. And so, moved into a market, decimated the taxi and livery industry, right? And they didn't have to be making money, whereas other folks had to be making money. Got a bunch of drivers hooked on, driving for these companies or, delivering for these companies, as the case may be, at wages that may have seemed, okay to begin with. And then because there's no, contracts, these drivers are not workers. They get zero protections from this company because they're flexible entrepreneurs. They're their own boss. Uber or Lyft or whoever can just drastically reduce their wages, right? And oftentimes there's sort of subprime lease agreements where Uber or Lyft are underwriting a, really high interest rate loan on a car and then sort of garnishing people's wages automatically, to make those payments, and drivers are trapped. And they're trapped as these sort of, powerful computational systems, the algorithms at the core of Uber and Lyft, and all of the data information are only in the hands of the company and are used to sort of, determine how little can we pay these people for, how much work. And so I think, some of the organizing that's most inspiring to me has been those gig workers organizing and pushing back. And actually, Prop 22 was sort of a response to that organizing because, starting around 2015, 2016, gig workers were organizing, but then sort of were pushed in California to get AB 5 passed, which was a law that clarified that they should be they should be classified as employees and get the benefits, recognition, and safety that classification gives them. And so Uber and Lyft went into overdrive, spent $205 million to pass a ballot initiative that created a loophole in AB 5 called Prop 22. Sadly, it passed because, it's clear, money and misinformation misled a lot of voters. And what Prop 22 does is sort of instantiate a third class of low rights worker. So, we're already seeing these companies push for that class of worker across the US. They want that instantiated across the board. And I think we need to take very, very, very seriously the fact that, more and more, most of our jobs are going to look like these sort of low rights working relationships. And that's, that is a fight that all of us should be invested in, because it's starting with gig workers, but it's clearly the intention is to spread that as widely as possible.
This is what I call a slow boil.
Mm-hmm.
With frogs, right? You don't realize, and you also think that this is not going to impact us. And it literally, like the world is on fire and you're just sitting there sipping your coffee and you're like, yeah, this is fine. I'm okay. So it's frustrating, this entire situation. The fact that they spend millions of dollars when they could have given that money for better working conditions. The fact these companies spend billions on lobbying when they could actually be giving that money back to their workers and helping them. It just seems in Silicon Valley, it's just like, it is just not the mindset, and that needs to change. And we need to force that, right? I deleted all my apps. I don't shop at Amazon. I'm one of probably the last remaining people who's sitting on this planet who will not shop at Amazon. Mm-hmm. I deleted the Uber and Lyft app. I have no idea after the pandemic how I'm going to get. I don't care. But somebody has to draw a line somewhere because we are complicit too, right? How do we because sometimes we always rely on government should do something. Legally, we could do something. We could. And the question is sometimes we also dismiss on our own role in maybe we could be doing something, right? So this is why I also wanted to also bring together this group of people, because we can't just leave technology to the experts who understand the complexity. We need folks like you come to us and explain some of this because you are the experts. Even if we got walked out of here with basic understanding of how this system is structured, where the power lies, how we could make an impact and make changes, I think that would be a huge step moving forward because when the information stays in a small bubble and only some people have that expertise or information, there's very little that the rest of us can actually do to support. So everything you're sharing with us, it's just wonderful. And it plays a huge role in moving us forward towards.
Yeah. Well, I learned from you all too. So I think this is again a type of solidarity. It's just sharing that and then, kind of making our power maps together.
Thank you. So I would like to talk to you about a recent, again, one of the very few highlights of these years when good things happen to good people. Tawana Petty was just took on the role National Organizing Director for Data for Black Lives. Yeah, it was super exciting. Congratulations to you on your appointment to the board of Signal Foundation. For folks, it's super exciting. I saw the news and I'm like, wow, yes, because this is an example of technology that's ethical, takes privacy seriously. So I'll give folks some background on what it is, and then I'll hand it over to you because I'd love to hear the details. Is Signal is a 501c3 nonprofit, and the flagship product, as many people might be aware of, is the Signal app. It doesn't have it's a private messaging app. I use it myself. It doesn't have those creepy surveillance features, so I'm being watched or surveilled, which is wonderful. Peace of mind. Brian Acton, who created again, another amazing app, which was WhatsApp. He's one of the co-founders, and then, which was sadly, I was so sad the day it was sold to Facebook. I'll be honest, my heart just broke. Because if anyone knows, please, they'll share links to the story behind WhatsApp. Again, fully encrypted. It was built with privacy first in mind. Love that app. So what I would love to know is, and our audience too, how did they convince you to join them? And what's the path forward for them?
Yeah, I mean, on joining, like I worked in sort of security and privacy on those issues and sort of in that community for a while. So I've been aware of Signal since it used to be called Text Secure, like was a much less slick app, but still had those fundamentals. And I think, for me, this technology is like a core infrastructure of dissent, right? Like we cannot organize as workers at a tech company if we are under the surveillance of these tech companies, right? And like I will say, most of the organizing that we did, the serious strategizing where we were thinking about, how do we take these risks and how do we protect each other and how do we build these whistleblowing networks, et cetera, all of that happened over Signal. And I think that's a testimony, because clearly our adversary is one of the most technologically sophisticated surveillance actors out there, and we simply need to be able to have these spaces to organize privately, to speak privately, to have candid, intimate, uncertain conversations without the powers that be, the bosses, the landlords, whoever else kind of looking in. So I think, I see this as like kind of essential core infrastructure for any social movement. And I know most of the people I know who are kind of organizing, there's just like, the first thing you do is you exchange a Signal number and then you get on some messy thread and you sort of work things out. So that's my commitment there, is like, that's where it stems from. I think we just absolutely need technologies like this, because a lot of the space for communication and for intimacy right now, especially under COVID, but more generally also is sort of on these digital communications platforms. So yeah, that's it's a pretty simple story, but I just I trust Signal. I know that Signal's sort of cryptographic primitives to to go there have been sort of vetted and validated and very carefully scrutinized. And I also have sort of opinions about where it could go. So, I took the opportunity to kind of help steward and shepherd that technology, because I think it's absolutely essential.
Well, I'll say they're lucky to have you, and gives me more faith in the future of the company because you're on the board. So it's going to be a win-win for all of us. So we have a few more minutes. I'd like to now circle back to what we started with. We have some more folks join us in the middle. Can we talk more about Timnit, Dr. Gebru? Just help us understand more of the context around this, like how things led to where we are, not the specific, but just a pattern that we've been seeing with these tech companies about retaliation. Do you feel like she's being made an example of in this industry right now, and to shut other dissenting voices? And what is the path forward? Like, So maybe two-part question.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear, like I'm not inside, and I think there are people who have a much deeper sensitivity to like the specific dynamics at work. I know, you know, I know that environment. I know it is, you know, it is racist. It has a lot of issues with kind of diversity, with just, you know, hearing and elevating brilliant people who don't fit the, you know, cis white mold. And so you know, I can speak to that. I think, you know, Timnit is somebody who did a lot of work to create space for, you know, others to be heard and others to be protected. I know she's a legendary manager at Google, like someone who you could actually do work under and be supported under, and you know, she would fight for you when they came. So I think, you know, I think that was seen, and like, you know, certainly was challenging a number of the people who didn't want to ruffle the status quo and didn't want their image smirched by their complicity. But I think there are, you know, there are other folks who could speak to those dynamics. I think it's certainly part of a pattern. It's certainly, you know, like when these companies get pushed too hard in a direction they don't want to move, they push back, and they can be really brutal. And I do, you know, I do think this is a steep inflect. You know, this is a break in our field right now. Like it's clear we can't just continue sort of with a kind of like curious thought experiment attitude toward these problems, and we need to say, you know, like we need to be rallying around Timnit. We need to be pushing back on these companies. We need to be fighting right now for whistleblower protections, for rigorous and intellectually robust research within these companies and beyond, sort of access to do those researches. And we need to, you know, we need to support Timnit in doing whatever, you know, she wants to do in pushing back as well. But I do think, you know, there's no sideline anymore, as I said before. There's, you know, this is, if you're going to be doing this work, I think the expectations just got clarified.
Understood. That's absolutely critical right now, so that we all have that understanding and ways to support for women who are in, and women, men, non-binary folks, all the audience that we have today. Could we talk a little bit more about in their own areas, their sphere of influence? This is not just about those who don't work at necessarily Google or are not in Timnit's sphere. What about them in their roles at their companies? Because I've been reading the chat, and some of them actually have lived through the same experience, because every time this incident happens, there are women out there who are like the Me Too movement, right?
Yeah.
One brave woman got up and stood up and said this happened. It suddenly empowered an entire legion, right, of women who have experienced very similar, had experience within Google, outside of Google, other tech companies, because power is power, right? And these tech companies have a lot of power, and even companies in general, even looking outside, again, we are focused on AI, but it is this general dynamic. So if somebody is watching you, listening to you right now, what advice would you give them? Like, what are some things they could do? Make their voices heard. We always hear about that, but how do they also protect themselves? Because that's important too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't, you know, I think that like organizing has stakes, right? That's, you know, it's not, there are risks, there are always risks. And I think, you know, everyone who, you know, the people who, you know, the hypothetical audience to whom I'm addressing this, they will know their context and their situation and those dynamics like better than I ever could, right? So there's like, you know, I don't think there's any one size fits all advice, but there's sort of, you know, in general, you know, don't trust management. You know, if you're, you know, you can escalate around the proper pipelines, but, you know, be careful about that and be canny, because, you know, HR and sort of, you know, other avenues like that are often, can often act as traps, and are not on your side. I think, you know, it's also always safer to like never go it alone, right? If you're going to speak up, being a lone voice is a target. So think about how you can organize with your colleagues or with other alliances of supporters, because it's because that's, you know, that'll provide more safety, and it will also begin to create those sort of connective tissues of solidarity that sort of, you know, any long-term change is going to require. So I think, you know, not go like use a you know, use Signal or something that is equally secure. Don't put things in writing. If you're organizing like keep a log of your interactions with leadership and different executives, because you need your receipts. So be really, really diligent about keeping those receipts. And then, do your power map, right? Like, what do you want and who has the power to give it to you? And like, what are the sort of creative tactics that you will know best because like you're in that context that you can use to push that. So I think, I don't know, that's like a really schematic kind of organizing 101. And I think there's a lot of people, who have a lot more insight. So you can sort of go online and read those. And there's also a lot of people who are willing to sort of organizers who are just willing to sit down and talk and help explore that. But I would say don't like be slow, be conscientious, and don't sort of, like it's really important not to let the like moment of rage sort of drive that action, because again, there are real stakes, and the more people who are involved, the more stakes there are for more people. Yeah. So that's some of what I got. Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. It's just that I don't share this very often, but I did. I was a people manager at Google for a while back. It was traumatizing. And one thing I've learned, and it's not just any company that you work at, the 101 is literally the HR is not there to protect you. HR is there to protect the company. Get your own lawyers, get your own support system inside and outside. Do not think they'll be there when yes, you need that protection. And that's exactly what you said. I cannot like empathize with more. I mean, this is something a lot of folks who are entering into the space do not realize, and just having it out, then you sharing that is going to help a lot of women from making the same mistakes probably a lot of us did back in the day. So that said, Meredith, thank you so much. I have like another minute still. I just want to check with you. I know that you have a lot going on. We will make sure we share the petition again right now. We'll put it in the chat again. But I do want to ask you, if you are you still available for another 15 minutes on Twitter? If folks want to chat with you?
I'll be on Twitter if you want to.
Okay.
If you guys want to tweet at me, and I'll tweet back.
Awesome. We'll use the hashtag, please use the hashtag 100 Brilliant Women, tag Meredith and put AMA so she knows these are the questions from this session. So 15 minutes on Twitter with Meredith. Don't miss this opportunity. As you can see, she's brilliant.
I'll be there. And I just want to also shout out, there are a ton of organizer trainings, right? Like, don't just listen to that. You can go to an organizer training, learn how to like sit down with your colleagues and ask these questions and build a relationship. So like this is a bridge to many other much more thorough resources.
Absolutely.
All right. Solidarity with Timnit. Thank you all. Thank you, Mia.